If you were with us last week, then you'll know that we jumped into a new series, which was really exciting coming out of the back of Easter, when we began to ask this question: where could your life start to intersect with the brokenness in the world all around you? Where could you start to find a unique imprint in the deep ruptures that are left in the world by sin and brokenness? And where could you start to step in and bring new life? Now, the reason that we started having this conversation, if you weren't able to join us last week, was because we're on the other side of Easter now. And often Easter just kind of gets left in the recesses of the Christian imagination, and we're not really sure what to make of it. We know that it has something to do with salvation and sin and God dusting us off and getting us ready for heaven. But very rarely do we step back and say, actually, here on the other side of Easter, what does Jesus' death and resurrection have to say to the way that I live in the world now? What does it have to say to the way that I interact with brokenness and hurt and pain right here in my own city or on the other side of the world? And that's the kind of questions we want to engage with through this series. So if you were with us last week, you'll know that we started that conversation in John 20, the end of that Gospel of John, where Mary stands outside the empty tomb. And she feels her hopes and dreams in tatters as she looks in and realizes that this Savior in whom she put all her hope turned out not to work. And worse still, now his body itself is missing. She stands outside the tomb, and then suddenly Jesus arrives on the scene. And Mary discovers the surprise not only that Jesus is now back, but the surprise that Jesus being back does not mean that she can hang on to him. It doesn't mean that she can just hold on to faith and spirituality for herself, but actually resurrection fundamentally means go and tell the world. It means as soon as you encounter the risen Christ, you're called out to share and to witness to that reality. You're called out to do for the world what you've discovered God has done for you. Now tonight I want to take this conversation a little bit deeper, and I want to ask the question around what it actually looks like to change the world. Now, last week I said that we're not going to give you a 7-step formula for how to change the world, because there are other churches that you can go to who would be more than happy to give that to you, but I'm not exactly sure that that's biblical. What we do know is biblical is that Jesus invites us into this reality on the other side of the cross and resurrection that says, now what are you going to make of the world? Not just what are you going to do with this faith, or what are you going to do with this religion or this spirituality, but what are you going to do with the brokenness in the world now that you've stood on the other side of Easter? If you are a millennial, and I think most of us are, then you've probably at some point come across this message that it's fundamentally embedded in you that you ought to change the world. If you've spent any time around a culture like ours, then you hear this message all the time, that millennials are the generation that exist, or at very least want to exist, to make tremendous impact in the world. And that's quite a unique thing when you look at it historically. Like, our grandparents didn't really think about changing the world, did they? Because they were busy getting through the Great Depression or trying to get through one of the bloodiest wars in human history. So the idea of how they're going to make really constructive impact in the world is not really something that's on their radar. And then you get our parents' generation, who say, okay, we're on the other side of the war, we're starting to come into economic prosperity, so we just want to build stuff. We just want to enjoy this security. You might have seen that a couple of weeks ago, coming into this series, we did a little Instagram poll on our platform Instagram page, and we asked the question, what matters more to you, security or significance? And I thought it was going to be about a 50-50 split. But it was almost entirely unanimously that people's life is oriented not around security, but the thirst for significance, the drive to do something constructive in the world, to do something constructive with their lives. So the question I want to engage with tonight is how do we respond to this idea that we are called to change the world? What does Jesus say to this reality? What if we step back for a second and ask, does Jesus want us to change the world, or does Jesus want us to bring positive impact into our world, no matter how small it might be? So we're going to launch in I'm going to give you guys 6 or 7 minutes around your tables to discuss this question, and that's going to set up our conversation tonight. Do you feel pressure to do something big with your life? Have you ever felt that, does this resonate with you when I say that as millennials, we're often told that we need to change the world and find that space where we can do that? Have you ever felt this pressure that you ought to really find the one big thing that you need to do with your life? So I'm going to give you guys 6 or 7 minutes around your tables, and then we'll be right back. So we probably find ourselves to some degree wrestling with this question at different times and in different ways. Are we actually called to change the world? Are we called to make that kind of significant impact in the world around us and even beyond us? Or are we called to just domesticate ourselves to regular routine of getting into a career and having 2.5 kids and getting a mortgage and then getting a nice coffin? It's a tougher question than we really realize, isn't it? Actually, do we feel that Jesus calls us to change the world in the way we often feel the pressure to in our society? Often we don't know where to start with this question because the problem seems, well, first, either too big. The problems in the world are far too vast and too far-reaching for little old you and me to make any significant impact in them. Or maybe the problems just seem too far away. Maybe when you see a video of Southeast Asian girls being rescued from trafficking, it moves you in a very deep way, but you think, how on earth can I begin to reach in to that problem? Often we think of the problems in the world, the kind of category of problems in which we put everything in terms of changing the world as a problem over there, but not something on my doorstep. And when we do that, we actually miss a deep reality. We miss a deeply resurrection-oriented reality. That to start reaching into the brokenness of the world, to start making a significant U-shaped imprint in everything that's wrong with the world, actually starts with the brokenness at the end of your own fingertips. Actually, it starts with the person right in front of you, the person next to you. It starts with the poverty right outside your window. And that's why I'm excited in this series, not only to tell you about Laos, as you saw on the video there, and we're going to talk more about that in a few moments, but also to tell you about the deeply broken issue of trafficking in our own city. If you join us on April 29th, we have an amazing guest from Chill Community, a fantastic organization in Calgary, reaching into this issue on a local level. Because we realize that the problem isn't really over there, is it? The problem is always closer than we think it is. In the Christian story, what God is doing to change the world isn't just concerned in the big, grand problems that are far away. Actually, it leaks into every crack and rupture of a broken creation. And your place in the story of God putting the world back together starts with the world at the end of your fingertips. And that's why tonight, I want to explore what this big story of God making everything new, has to do with all of our very small stories. So let's recap where we left off last week with Mary standing outside the empty tomb. It says this: early on the first day of the week, while it was still dark, Mary Magdalene went to the tomb and saw that the stone had been removed from the entrance. So she came running to Simon Peter and the other disciple, the one Jesus loved, and said, "They've taken the Lord out of the tomb, and we don't know where they've put him." So Peter and the other disciple started for the tomb. When they arrived, they saw the strips of linen lying there, as well as the cloth that had been wrapped around Jesus' head. The cloth was still lying in its place, separate from the linen. They still did not understand from Scripture that Jesus had to rise from the dead. Then the disciples went back to where they were staying. Now Mary stood outside the tomb crying. As she wept, she bent over to look into the tomb and saw two angels in white seated where Jesus' body had been, one at the head and the other at the foot. They asked her, "Woman, why are you crying?" "They've taken my Lord away," she said, "and I don't know where they've put him." At this, she turned around and saw Jesus standing there, but she didn't realize that it was Jesus. He asked her, "Woman, why are you crying? Who is it you're looking for?" Thinking he was the gardener, she said, "Sir, if you've carried him away, tell me where you've put him, and I will get him." Jesus said to her, "Mary." Thinking he was the gardener. Now, I love it when Scripture includes these little details that you can gloss over so quickly that you almost miss the significance of them. New creation is bursting into existence as Jesus walks out of a tomb in Jerusalem 2,000 years ago, and Mary thinks that he's there to trim the petunias. See, don't ever miss the details in these little throwaway pieces in Scripture. How many of you know not to take anything that the Bible says as an accident? Often we read it and we think it's an incidental piece of detail that really doesn't need to be there. Actually, often these little details are there to make us ask the question, maybe something bigger is going on. The Gospel of John is written as a retelling of the creation story. And Tori referenced it earlier. Actually, Genesis 1, the very first words of it start with the exact same words as John 1. What John's doing is saying, actually, behind this small story of a Jewish carpenter bringing God's salvation into the world and being crucified by the Roman Empire is a much bigger story of God remaking everything. He's saying what God did at the beginning is what Jesus is now doing again. And John is trying to tell you that it's not just what Jesus is doing here, but what part you have to play in the story of new creation. And here he throws in this little detail. Mary thought he was the gardener. Now, where have we seen a garden before? Genesis 1 says, "So God created humankind in his image. In the image of God, he created them, male and female, he created them. God blessed them and said to them, be fruitful and multiply." John is referencing back to this archetypal garden in the Jewish imagination that we call Eden, the center point of God's original creation. Now, in the Jewish imagination, God creates this garden called Eden and he gives it to Adam and Eve, but it's not just a gift, he gives it as a mission. He says, be fruitful and multiply. Expand Eden into this wilderness creation that I've left to your imagination. Often we think of creation as a closed system, don't we? We know the story. God made everything. He made the creepy things that creepeth and the crawly things that crawleth. And he said, that's perfect. And then he rested, which means that creation just becomes the name that you and I give to the space that we find ourselves inhabiting in the everyday world. But in the biblical imagination, creation is something much deeper. In the biblical imagination, creation is handed over to humanity unfinished, open-ended, open to the imagination of what you and I will make of it. He says, be fruitful and multiply. He says, don't just hold on to this little patch of perfection that you have, but take it into the world. Take this imagination of how the world could mirror this good creation and see what it becomes. You see, you were born with the image of God written in you, which means, if it means anything, that you were born with the creative potential to bring life into existence written into the fabric of your DNA, the spark of the divine. Whatever it is that God is made of, you are designed to mirror it in the world, to replicate it, to let it spill out of you into a broken creation. Humanity is created with the potential to imagine life itself into existence. Yet most people just inhabit the world, don't they? When you are made to reimagine it. Have you ever met the kind of person who seems to believe, for whatever reason, that they have already extracted out of life the very best that it has to give them? The kind of person who will say things like, I guess life doesn't get any better than this. The kind of person who has no imagination for what their future could become because they've sold out to the idea that what they have right now is pretty much the best that can be brought out of life. Maybe you can call them sleepwalkers. They're the kinds of people who just bumble around life and they bumble through the world, never really questioning the direction that they're going in because they've never stopped believing that actually this is the very best there is. And they've never stopped long enough to actually dare to imagine that maybe there's a destiny for them to walk into. They've stopped believing that they can do more than inhabit life, they can actually participate in creating it. You see, it's a deep, deep tragedy when the greatest discovery of a person's life is the belief that there's nothing worth discovering. You know people like this, the kind of person who orients their life around the idea that there's nothing in the world that's really worthy of their life, nothing worthy of the cost of giving their life to it. That deep longing in them for adventure, that longing instilled in the heart of every human being, they believe it doesn't speak of a deeper reality that's begging to be imagined into existence. And I wonder if this is the kind of way that Mary feels when she sits here in the garden looking at her hopes and dreams dashed, wondering if life gets any better than this, wondering what she's going to do with her life now, when her potential and her future is dead and buried in a tomb and now the body itself is missing. And then Jesus turns up and she thinks he's the gardener. Now, this is classic biblical humor. I don't know if you know that the Bible tells jokes, but it tells a lot of jokes. I don't really get them, but in the Hebrew imagination, this is a really funny joke because she thinks he's the gardener. She thinks he's there to clean up the pots and plants and decorate the graves of the dead, to give the tombs a nice aesthetic. But he isn't there to decorate a reality that's devoid of life. He's there to bring new life into a dead world. She thinks he's the gardener who sits and kind of walks about the current reality of creation, tending it and making it look a little bit nicer, but he's actually the creator, the one who brings new life into existence. And the creator gives the mandate over to humanity. He stands in this new creation and he says to Mary, go. He says to Mary, go and reimagine what the world could become, because I have made all things new. See, I wonder if John's trying to tell us something. I wonder if he's trying to tell us that not just what Jesus is doing here, but actually what part we have to play in the story of what Jesus is doing to bring new creation. Behind the details, there is always a much bigger story. Now, John kind of leaves us here wondering if we get the Hebrew joke. The Apostle Paul, as he often does, goes a little bit deeper, and he pulls back the curtain on the bigger story behind the details. He says this in Colossians. We look at this sun and see the God who cannot be seen. We look at this sun and see God's original purpose in everything created. For everything, absolutely everything, above and below, visible and invisible, rank after rank after rank of angels. Everything got started in him and finds its purpose in him. He was there before any of it came into existence, and he holds it all together right up to this moment. He was supreme in the beginning, and leading the resurrection parade, he's supreme in the end. From beginning to end, he's there, towering far above everything, everyone. Not only that, but all the broken and dislocated pieces of the universe, people and things, animals and atoms, get properly fixed and fit together in vibrant harmonies, all because of his death, his blood that poured down from the cross. If you're anything like me, then it's a perennial temptation to think of Jesus, his life and his death and his resurrection, as something that pertains only to you. That it's something to do with personal salvation. Like I said before, it's something to do with God dusting us off and getting you fit and ready for heaven. But actually, the story is much bigger than your own personal brokenness. It says all things get fit together in Jesus. So your pain might get fit together, because he says all things. What about my past hurts and regrets and brokenness? All things. What about poverty? What about violence? What about injustice here in Calgary and all around the world? What about people who are broken out of their families and caught into a cycle of human trafficking? All things. He says new creation touches everything. And that is why participating in what God is doing to put the world right starts very small, and it starts very local. Because it's not just about the big stuff, but about everything that's being put right. It's why it starts at the end of your fingertips. It's why it starts with that little patch of broken creation to which you have access. So maybe the question is not, can I change the world? Maybe the question is, where do I want to start? Maybe the question is, what brokenness is within my reach? What problem could I solve that's not just over there, but that's right here in my orbit? And I want to say this, there is no brokenness in the world that is not a valid place for you to start. Sometimes, particularly if you haven't been a Christian for very long, you find yourself trapped in this pressure to say there must be some things that are more valuable than others. Like we start to talk about global missions as something that entails more focus and more saintliness than helping people on your own doorstep. Actually, maybe for you, you're sitting there tonight and thinking, the thing I want to reach into is very small and it's very local. And my question to you is, what do you want to change? Not can you change the world, but what patch of the broken world that you find yourself in do you want to start with? See, if Jesus walked out of the grave and said this, right, we're skipping town on this whole of a planet, and instead we're going to heaven, then we'd have to conclude that the world doesn't really matter. But Jesus didn't do that. Jesus walked out of the tomb and said, don't hold on to me, go and make the world new. I want to tell you a story about a friend of mine. Her name is Simpon. She was a high-profile businesswoman working in Russia. She's originally from Southeast Asia. And then she went home to visit Laos one day. And she noticed for the first time a problem that had been right on her doorstep all along, but she'd never seen before. A problem that nobody really seemed to notice, and certainly nobody was doing anything about. She started to notice that there were girls as young as 5 sitting outside what they call beer shops, brothels, eliciting sex. And she found herself saying, maybe I'd always thought that that is a problem that happens over there, but I've never noticed it on my own doorstep. And so what she started doing was going into the brothels and rescuing the girls out of them. She started bringing them education and food and healthcare. She started taking them into her home until this ministry expanded and expanded. And now it's called Salt and Light. It's the ministry that you saw a little glimpse of in the video a few moments ago. And it started with somebody who dared to imagine that maybe what God was doing was not just something on the other side of the world, but something right on our own doorstep. My question is, what about you? What if you stopped looking at the problems over there and wondering where you could step in and instead started asking, what are the problems right at the end of my fingertips? What is God doing to fix a broken creation right at the end of my nose? See, I want to give you a principle to work with. It's this. If it's true that you're designed not just to inhabit the world, but to participate in what God's doing, to make everything new, then a pretty good way to live is to dream very, very big and live very, very small. You see, you must be given permission, if you've been brought into this participation in new creation, to dream big. Dreaming big is knitted into the fabric of your being. That's why you find yourself imagining what your life could become, or what the lives of people around you could become, or what the life of the world could become. That hunger for significance is knitted into your DNA. But the way that you participate in creation is to live small. Mother Teresa said this: do you want to be great? Pick up a broom and sweep the floor. You're invited to dream very big, and you're invited to participate in what those dreams could become by living very small. When I first moved to Africa, I went with the distinct idea that I was going to be the axis on which the fate of Africa turns. I was pretty sure of it. Like, they would talk about the history of Africa kind of like we talk about human history with BC and AD. It was going to be like before Adam and after Adam, everything improved. And I was utterly convicted of this. And then I arrived and realized there were people more suited for this work than I were. There were people more equipped, there were people more qualified to participate in what God was doing in Africa. And I found myself deeply dejected. And I started praying. I started asking God, what on earth have you brought me for if I can't really make the kind of impact that I want to? And I felt deeply that God said something to me. He said this: I brought you here to learn how to sweep the floor. I brought you here to learn that whatever dreams you have for your impact in the world, however broad or however deep you think your imprint in a broken world ought to be, none of it matters. Those dreams never come to any kind of creative fruition unless you learn how to sweep the floor. Think with me for a second about the great world changers of human history. Martin Luther King, Francis of Assisi, Mother Teresa, Gandhi, Jesus himself. They are the people who the greatest positive impact upon the world is made because they dare to dream with an audacious imagination of the imprint that they can leave in the world, but they dare to live with a radical degree of servanthood. You see, dreaming big is not really worth much if you're not willing to sweep the floor, is it? And you and I know the kinds of people, often they're similar ages to you and I, who have a great imagination for what they want to do in the world. Maybe they attribute it to God, or maybe they attribute it to their own capabilities, like it would be a waste if I didn't change the world because I'm the only person who has what it takes to change the world. But then you find yourself thinking, yeah, but you're not really willing to do any work. You're not really willing to actually get your head down. You're not really willing to jump into the grind of daily life, to do the tough work that people don't want to do. Why? Because it looks like the furthest thing from changing the world. Because when you say you want to make an impact in the world, how often do you step back and think, it might look like sweeping the floor. It might look like serving one person. But equally, I want to give you this caveat. Sweeping the floor also doesn't do a lot to change the world unless you're aware of how it's serving a much bigger purpose than you. You're aware of how it's serving a much more imaginative idea of how this is leaving an imprint in the world. Which is to say that you won't change the world by domesticating your built-in drive for adventure and creativity. You won't change the world by just joining the monotonous daily chorus of everyday existence instead of discovering the unique voice that only you can bring into the world. And so maybe you're sat there thinking, but I'm just a student. Maybe you're sat there thinking, actually, I'm unemployed. Or maybe you're sat there thinking, I have no idea what to do with my life. Maybe you have this deep hunger for significance, but you have absolutely no idea where to direct it. Or maybe you're sat there thinking, actually, none of that's me. I'm the person for whom life has fundamentally gone wrong. I'm the person who found themselves on a bad trajectory. Maybe the kind of trajectory that there's no coming back from. I'm the kind of person who's out of options. Change the world? I can't even put food on the table. And you stop trying to find your place in the world. But I want to encourage you. Stop trying to find your place in the world by looking at where you could have the broadest impact and going there. And realize that the world is changed simply because you're in it. That you change the world every single day of your life. Because you leave things behind you that weren't there before. The choice is not whether you will change the world or not. The question is, will you be a destructive force in the world, or will you create something new out of it? When you look at your relationships, how often do you find yourself thinking you're a subject of what happens to you? If somebody does something to upset you and then you say, I guess it's a bad relationship. Instead of asking, maybe there's some constructive and creative potential to bring new life out of this. How often do you find yourself wrestling with questions of mental health and asking, am I just a subject of whatever happens to me? Do I have any control in the world whatsoever? I can't even control my response to it. My challenge is this. A lot of people just inhabit the world. And inhabiting the world means inhabiting terrain that somebody else has prepared for you. It means just taking the world at face value, exactly the way it is, and never imagining that it could be anything better. But you were called to create a world. And creating means going into the unmapped terrain and bringing something new out of it. Something that only you can leave behind because it reflects something of yourself imprinted onto the brokenness of the world. I want to close by telling you another story. I have a good friend called Andrew. And Andrew did his MBA at university. And then he came to the end of it with a deeply clear vision of what he was going to do with his life, which was take it into the business world, create a business, he was very entrepreneurial, and run something that's going to make him very, very rich. And then he got married, and he and his wife decided instead what they were going to do was pray a very, very dangerous prayer, which is this: God, this year, we will do anything that you ask us to do. Their prayer was kind of funny. He said, we will actually do what you ask us to do. Now, the reason that's a dangerous prayer is because sometimes God answers by saying, I want you to go to Laos. And that's what happened to Andrew. So Andrew finds himself with a fresh MBA, asking himself, what on earth is this going to bring to the fight against human trafficking? He joined Simpon, the lady I told you about before. And he said, I'm not really sure what I have to bring to the table here because you're rescuing girls out of human trafficking and I'm a guy with an MBA. And what Andrew ended up doing was setting up a cafe. You saw a little clip of it in the video that provides sustainable revenue for the organization. He set up a cafe that not only provides revenue for the organization, but provides visas and work permits for volunteers to come from all around the world. The reason that I'm friends with Andrew, the reason even more that I'm friends with Simpon, is because the cafe allows me to go in to Laos and to help rescue girls out of human trafficking. But what about you? What if you were to stop asking, how can I change the world? What if you were to stop looking at your life and trying to determine what shape you are and where that fits into the brokenness of the world, and instead you were to start asking, how can I just participate in what God is doing to change the world? How can I step in? Where can I leave my mark, no matter how big or small it might be? What if you were to stop looking at your greatest skills and experiences and passions and trying to wedge them into constructive impact in the world, and instead you were to ask, God, where do you want me to step in? Because anything you ask me to do, I'll actually do. I want to close with this quote by William Cavanaugh. He says, the only way to change the world is to live as if God already has changed the world, because he has. The only way to change the world is to choose to step back from believing that it's in your capabilities or your lack of capabilities that you have to ask the question of how you are able to make your mark in the world, or whether you should withdraw from the pursuit altogether. But actually, to change the world, starts with the deep belief that Jesus has changed it and that he invites you to participate. It's that kind of pursuit. It's that kind of irresistible invitation to help recreate the world in God's image because he created you in his image that drives you to give your life to girls in Laos, that drives you to work with the homeless in Calgary, that drives you to step into the deep brokenness in the world and to dare to believe that God wants you to dream big for what could happen and to live it out by serving. So listen, guys, it's always great to be together, and I want to close with a couple of questions which I'm going to leave you to wrestle with around your tables. What do you find harder, dreaming big or living small? And thinking about your own life, when you look at your own circumstances, relationships, career, placement in life, how might you change from just inhabiting your world to helping to change it? So listen, guys, it's always great to be together. If you have to take off, then have a safe drive home. Otherwise, I can encourage you to wrestle with these questions around your table, and we hope to see you next Sunday. Thanks.